In 1777, George Washington's men weren't just fighting the greatest military superpower on Earth. They were fighting the total, catastrophic collapse of the American economy. Look, history books love to tell you that the Continental Army was starving because the British blockaded their supplies, but that is a lie. The food was there. The winter coats were there. But Washington's men were dying in the freezing mud because they were the victims of the worst hyperinflation crisis, supply chain corruption, and market volatility in American history. This isn't just a story about a war. This is the story of fiat currency, high-risk venture capital, and war profiteers getting rich off the blood of freezing soldiers. Imagine signing a contract to risk your life. You march hundreds of miles. You stand in an open field while chunks of lead fly at your face at 1,000 feet per second. And when payday finally comes, the money they hand you is literally worthless. This was the ultimate liquidity crisis. Now, when the American Revolution began, the Continental Congress had a massive, glaring problem. They had zero capital. They had no power to levy taxes and absolutely no gold or silver reserves to back their spending. So, what was their solution? They turned on the money printers. They created the Continental Dollar. It was a pure fiat currency backed by absolutely nothing except the promise that America might win the war. But as the war dragged on, month after month, year after year, Congress just printed more and more and more. By the time the Army dragged itself into winter quarters, hyperinflation had completely destroyed the purchasing power of the American soldier. Let's look at the ground-level reality of this economic collapse. Think about a soldier making standard military wages. He would take his newly printed paper money to a local Pennsylvania farmer just hoping to buy a single loaf of bread or a wool blanket to survive the night. But the farmer would just laugh in his face. Why? Because the British Army, camped just a few miles away in Philadelphia, was paying in hard assets, gold and silver sterling. If you were a local merchant or a farmer, your profit margins depended on real liquidity, not rebel paper. Washington's men were literally starving to death in the middle of some of the richest farm country in the world. They weren't dying of a lack of resources, they were dying from a collapsed currency. To put this in perspective, a pair of leather boots that cost $1 before the war suddenly cost a wheelbarrow full of paper Continentals. The soldiers were completely bankrupt, trapped in a winter hellscape with absolutely no way to buy their own survival. And the worst part? As inflation spiraled, the psychological toll broke these men. You can survive a lot if you know your family back home is taken care of, but these soldiers were sending paper money back to their wives, only to find out it couldn't even buy a bag of flour. But worthless money was really half the problem. What happens when the military supply chain itself is intentionally corrupted by the very people who were supposed to be saving you? In the modern corporate world, we talk a lot about supply chain logistics, vendor fraud, and corporate greed. But the B2B contractors of the Revolutionary War, they wrote the original playbook on war profiteering. When George Washington looked at his army, he didn't just see brave patriots, he saw a logistical nightmare. Congress had outsourced the acquisition of food, clothing, and weapons to private contractors. These men were supposed to secure the assets necessary to keep the ground troops alive. But instead, they saw a massive opportunity to maximize their personal profit margins at the expense of human life. The reality of a supply chain collapse isn't a line on a spreadsheet. It is a 19-year-old kid wrapping his frostbitten, rotting feet in dirty rags because the winter boots he was promised never arrived. Contractors would intentionally hoard wool and leather. They would stockpile it in private warehouses to artificially restrict the supply, driving the market price higher and higher and higher, while the soldiers froze to death in their tents. But when it came to food, the fraud was even deadlier. You see, government contractors were paid by the total weight of the provisions they delivered. To increase their return on investment and cheat the government, corrupt merchants would pack heavy river rocks into the bottom of wooden barrels. Then they would cover those rocks with a thin layer of cheap, rotting beef, seal it up, and ship it to the front lines. Imagine being a starving soldier. You pry open a barrel after a brutal day of marching in the snow. The smell of rancid, decomposing meat hits your face, only to find out that half the barrel is completely inedible stone. Thousands of men died of dysentery, disease, and starvation simply because corrupt businessmen wanted a better quarterly return. The system was totally rigged, the government was broke, and the ground-level worker, the soldier, paid the ultimate price. So, if the Continental Army was a financial black hole of death and starvation, how did anyone actually make money during the American Revolution? Where was the wealth going? Well, to find the real money, you had to look away from the mud and look to the ocean. You had to join the deadliest venture capital startups in human history. Forget Silicon Valley, forget modern tech startups. The greatest risk-to-reward ratio in American history was found on the blood-soaked deck of a privateer ship. When the war started, America had virtually no navy. They simply couldn't afford the massive capital expenditure required to build one. So Congress issued what were called letters of marque, essentially legalizing piracy against the British Empire. And this birthed an explosive, highly volatile venture capital market. Here is exactly how the economics worked. Wealthy colonial investors, merchants, politicians, even some of the founding fathers would pool their capital to buy a fast ship and outfit it with heavy cannons. They would then hire a crew of desperate, poor young men. But here's the catch. These sailors weren't paid a salary. They worked entirely for equity. If the ship sailed out into the Atlantic and found nothing, the sailors starved and the investors lost all their capital, total write-off. But if they successfully hunted down and captured a massive British merchant ship loaded with sugar, Jamaican rum, or military weapons, that cargo was dragged back to port and liquidated at auction, and everyone got a share of the profits. The ground-level reality of this was absolutely terrifying. Think about it. You are 18 years old. You're standing on a wooden deck, slipping with the blood of your friends. The smell of sulfur and salt is burning your lungs. You are staring down the barrel of British cannons, knowing that in the next 30 seconds, you are either going to be blown into 1,000 pieces, or you are going to capture enough assets to make you and your family rich for a generation. The ROI was astronomical. Some sailors made more in a single successful 6-week privateering cruise than they could have made in 10 years of backbreaking farm labor. It was the ultimate high-risk, high-reward startup culture. But while the privateers were getting incredibly rich on ocean equity, Washington's ground troops were going completely bankrupt in the mud. They had no equity. They had no hard assets. They were trapped in a toxic contract. And eventually, the workforce snapped. By 1781, the financial ruin of the American soldier reached a massive breaking point. We love to think of the founding fathers and the troops as these beautifully united patriots, but economics doesn't care about patriotism when your children are starving. Many of these men were drafted poor. Some were indentured servants who were promised a bounty of cash and 100 acres of land if they just survived the war. But because of the hyperinflation we talked about, their enlistment bounties were totally worthless. In fact, many had gone deep into personal debt just trying to buy their own clothes to survive the winters. The ROI of enlisting in the Continental Army wasn't just low, it was deeply negative. On New Year's Day, 1781, the Pennsylvania Line enacted a hostile takeover. They mutinied. They killed an officer, they seized the artillery, and they began marching on Congress in Philadelphia, demanding to be paid in hard currency, gold or silver. This wasn't just a military rebellion. This was an armed, desperate labor strike. They were officially declaring a breach of contract. George Washington was terrified. His entire organization was on the verge of bankruptcy and total liquidation. To save the army, he had to make a brutal, ground-level executive decision. When a second, smaller mutiny broke out in the New Jersey line shortly after, Washington did not negotiate. He ordered his most loyal, well-fed troops to surround the mutineers in their sleep. He then forced the leaders of the mutiny to be executed by their own friends. The firing squad was entirely made up of men who had mutinied right alongside them. It was a horrifying psychological tactic to crush the rebellion, force compliance, and keep the army from financially dissolving. The American Revolution was won in the dirt, the blood, and the freezing snow, but it was nearly lost on the ledger. Washington's men survived a collapsed fiat currency, rampant corporate corruption, and the complete destruction of their personal wealth. History isn't just about dates and battles, it is a mirror for today's markets. The Continental Army's nightmare is the ultimate historical lesson in what happens when a currency loses its purchasing power, when inflation spirals completely out of control, and when critical supply chains break down. If there's one thing you can learn from the freezing, bankrupt heroes of 1776, it's that you have to protect your assets. When governments print unlimited fiat currency, the ground-level worker always pays the price. You do not want to be left holding worthless paper when the economic winter hits. You have to take control of your financial future today. Whether it's diversifying into hard assets, learning how to invest in high ROI markets, or just getting your personal budget out of the debt trap, you need to start building your economic defense line right now. Don't wait for the government to save you, because, as Washington's men learned the hard way, they won't. And speaking of brutal winters, if you thought the revolutionary supply chain was a nightmare, you won't believe the absolute hellscape soldiers faced during the freezing winters of the 1860s. Click the video on your screen right now to see how men survived the deadliest blizzards of the 1860s using nothing but raw grit, animal fat, and absolute desperation. I will see you over there.